You gave everything, not as a figure of speech, literally. You gave time you didn't have, money you couldn't spare, emotional presence at moments when your own interior was already at capacity. You restructured your life around someone else's needs so completely that at some point you stopped being able to locate clearly where your choices ended and their requirements began. And what came back? Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, in the particular texture of how they spoke to you, what they assumed about you, how quickly the giving was forgotten and replaced by the expectation of more, was not what giving that much is supposed to produce. It was something that looked, if you allowed yourself to name it honestly, like resentment. Nietzsche encountered this pattern everywhere he looked in human relationships, and he refused to explain it away with comfortable reassurances about ingratitude or human nature. In On the Genealogy of Morality, published in 1887, he traced the psychology of giving and receiving with a precision that most moral philosophy has always been too invested in the romance of sacrifice to attempt. What he found was not a paradox. It was a mechanism, consistent, predictable, and almost entirely invisible to the person who is being consumed by it while it operates. This video is about that mechanism. Not so you can stop giving, but so you can finally understand what has been happening and what it has been costing both of you. If you have ever felt the specific bewilderment of having given everything to someone and received resentment in return, give this video a like right now. Because what follows is going to name something that most people spend years experiencing without ever being permitted to understand. 1. The invisible debt that giving always creates. Roy Baumeister at Florida State University has spent decades researching the psychology of self-esteem, obligation, and what happens inside human beings when the balance of giving and receiving within a relationship becomes severely asymmetrical. His findings on what researchers call indebtedness, the specific psychological state that arises when one person has received significantly more than they have given, are among the most consistently replicated in social psychology and among the least discussed in ordinary conversation about relationships. What Baumeister found was not that gratitude follows generosity. What he found was that gratitude follows generosity up to a point, and that beyond that point, something qualitatively different begins to accumulate. When the debt becomes large enough that repayment feels impossible, the psychological response shifts. Gratitude, which requires the recipient to hold the giver in a position of benefactor, becomes increasingly uncomfortable to maintain, because maintaining it means maintaining an interior acknowledgement of inferiority, of having needed, of having been incapable, of having been witnessed in a moment of dependence by someone who was, in that moment, demonstrably more capable. The human ego, Baumeister's research consistently shows, does not tolerate this position indefinitely. It finds a way to rebalance, not through repayment, which the debt has grown too large to make plausible, but through reframing. The giver is recast. Their generosity becomes something other than generosity. It becomes control or condescension, or the expression of a need to be needed that says something unflattering about them. The gift is retrospectively reinterpreted in ways that reduce the debt by reducing the value of what was given. Nietzsche named this process with characteristic directness in On the Genealogy of Morality. He described how the creditor-debtor relationship, even when it operates through love rather than money, produces in the debtor a specific psychological pressure that has nowhere honest to go. The debt cannot be repaid. The acknowledgement of the debt is too painful to maintain. And so the debtor does what the psyche does when it cannot resolve a tension. It transforms it. Gratitude becomes resentment. The person who gave the most becomes, over time, the person the recipient most needs to diminish. 2. Sacrifice that was never requested creates obligation that was never agreed to. Adam Grant at the Wharton School in research that became the foundation of his 2013 work, Give and Take, identified something that complicates the simple moral arithmetic most people apply to generosity. Not all giving is equivalent in its effects on the relationship it enters. Giving that responds to a genuine, expressed need, that arrives when it is asked for, in the form it is asked for, in the quantity that was requested, tends to produce the gratitude that giving is supposed to produce. The recipient asked. You responded. The exchange is legible to both parties. The debt is roughly proportional to what was requested, and therefore roughly manageable in terms of repayment or acknowledgement. But giving that exceeds what was asked for, that anticipates needs before they are expressed, that offers more than the situation required, that restructures your life around someone else's well-being without being invited to do so, creates a fundamentally different dynamic. It installs an obligation the recipient never agreed to carry. You gave them something they didn't ask for, and now they owe you for it. The generosity from the recipient's interior can begin to feel like a trap, one that has been constructed with the best possible intentions, but that closes around them just as completely as any other. Nietzsche, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, made this distinction central to what he called the gift-giving virtue, the highest form of giving in his framework, which is precisely characterized by giving that does not create dependence, that does not require the recipient to reorganize their sense of self around the debt, that gives in ways that make the other person stronger rather than more obligated. The giving that produces resentment is almost always its opposite, giving that was organized, however unconsciously, around the giver's need to give rather than the recipient's genuine need to receive. 3. Why your sacrifice makes them see themselves in ways they cannot tolerate. This is the dimension of the mechanism that Nietzsche identified most clearly, and that remains the most difficult to discuss honestly because it requires saying something about the people who have hurt you that moves past blame into something more uncomfortable, understanding. When you sacrifice significantly for another person, you become a witness to something they may not be able to bear being witnessed. You have seen them in need. You have seen the specific shape of what they could not manage alone, could not provide for themselves, could not access without your intervention. You carry that knowledge, and your continued presence, your continued generosity, your continued evidence of capability relative to their need, is a continuous reminder of a moment of vulnerability they would prefer to have dissolved entirely. John Bowlby's attachment research identified the specific terror that underlies this dynamic. The fear of being seen in one's full dependency by someone whose regard you cannot afford to lose. When that fear is triggered by the ongoing presence of the person who witnessed the dependency, the psyche engages a protective mechanism. Distance, devaluation, the gradual construction of a narrative in which the person who helped is recast as someone whose help says something problematic about them. They are not doing this consciously. That is the most important thing to understand about this mechanism and the thing that Nietzsche's framework makes most clearly visible. Ressentiment, the specific psychological structure he described in On the Genealogy of Morality, is not a chosen posture. It is what forms when pain has nowhere honest to go, when the person who was helped cannot express the vulnerability the help revealed, cannot repay the debt the help created, and cannot tolerate the ongoing reminder that the help represents. The resentment forms in the only space available, and it points, with a consistency that looks like ingratitude but is actually something more structural, toward the person who gave the most. Think about the relationship in your life where the more you gave, the more the dynamic shifted against you. Comment below, my sacrifice deserved better than this. Just that, because the person who needs that sentence has been carrying someone else's resentment as if it were their own failure for long enough. 4. The specific way overgiving erases the boundary between you. Salvador Minuchin's concept of enmeshment developed through decades of clinical work and family systems therapy, applies with uncomfortable precision to relationships organized around significant, sustained sacrifice. When one person gives continuously and extensively enough, the boundary between what belongs to them and what belongs to the other person becomes genuinely difficult to locate. You have given so much of your time, energy, attention, and interior life to someone else's needs that your own needs have become, functionally, secondary to theirs in the organization of your daily existence. This dissolution serves neither of you. For you, it means the gradual loss of a self that is distinct enough to be genuinely present in the relationship. A self with its own needs, its own direction, its own legitimate claims on the resources you keep redirecting outward. For the person receiving the giving, it means being in a relationship with someone who has made themselves so available, so organized around the recipient's needs, that the recipient has no genuine other to be in relationship with. You have become an extension of their needs rather than a separate person they are choosing to be close to. Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, wrote about this dissolution with particular sharpness. The person who gives without limit does not, in the end, give more. They give less. Because what they ultimately eliminate is the very difference that made the relationship meaningful. You cannot genuinely connect with someone who has no interior to connect to. The sacrifice, pursued to its logical conclusion, removes the person making it from the relationship it was designed to strengthen. This channel exists outside the algorithm. No sponsorships, no brand deals, just research, writing, and the belief that ideas sharp enough to change how you see yourself are worth protecting. If this is giving you language for something you have been living without being able to name, consider supporting this work directly through the link in the description. Every contribution keeps this independent, and that independence is what allows this kind of honesty. 5. What Nietzsche says you should have done instead, and what you can do now. In Aurora, published in 1881, Nietzsche wrote something that sounds harsh until you understand exactly what it is protecting. Help that strengthens is different from help that creates dependence, and the difference matters more than the quantity of what is given. The giving that produces gratitude rather than resentment, that builds the relationship rather than corroding it from the inside, is giving that leaves the recipient more capable than it found them. Not giving that solves their problem while leaving them unable to solve the next one. Not giving that exceeds what they asked for, until the excess becomes the defining feature of the relationship. Not giving that is organized, even unconsciously, around your need to be needed rather than their genuine need to receive. Adam Grant's research on effective giving identified what he called the otherish giver, the person who gives generously but maintains enough self-regard to ensure the giving is sustainable, boundaried, and genuinely responsive to what is actually needed rather than what the giver's interior drive toward sacrifice is propelling them toward. The otherish giver does not give less. They give more effectively, because they give in ways that can be received without the recipient having to reorganize their self-image around the debt. Epictetus, in the Enchiridion, made the distinction that applies most directly to where you are now, between what you can change and what you cannot. You cannot undo the giving. You cannot retroactively restructure the relationship into something more balanced. What you can do, what belongs entirely to you, is change what you do next. Not out of bitterness, not as punishment, but as the honest recognition that giving in ways that produce resentment serves neither of you, and that the most genuinely generous thing you can offer from this point forward is the boundary that the relationship was missing. Marco Aurelius, in Meditations, returned again and again to a related practice: the distinction between responding to what is actually in front of you and reacting to what you wish were there instead. The relationship in front of you is the one that exists, with its actual dynamics, its actual history, its actual response to what you have given. Giving more of the same thing that has already produced resentment is not generosity. It is the refusal to see clearly what the relationship is telling you. Now the part that requires the most honesty, because across everything this video has described, the debt psychology, the ego protection, the enmeshment, the resentment, there is a thread that belongs to you as much as to the people who received what you gave. Why did you give that much? Not as an accusation, as a genuine question worth sitting with. Because the giving that reaches the level described in this video, the giving that restructures your life, that suppresses your needs over years, that continues past the point where any honest reading of the relationship would suggest it was working, is almost never organized purely around the recipient's well-being. It is organized, at least in part, around something internal to the giver, the need to be indispensable, the fear of what the relationship becomes if you stop being the one who gives most, the identity that has been built over time around being the person who sacrifices, who is defined by their generosity, whose value in the relationship is constituted by what they provide rather than who they are. Nietzsche, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, described the gift-giving virtue not as the compulsion to give, but as the overflow of genuine abundance, the state of being so full of your own life that giving becomes a natural consequence of living it fully rather than a strategy for securing your place in someone else's. The giving that produces resentment is almost always the other kind, the giving that comes from scarcity, from fear, from a self that has been organized around others' needs precisely because organizing around its own feels too dangerous, too selfish, too much like the kind of person you were taught not to be. That is not a verdict. It is the beginning of a more honest relationship with your own giving. One that asks, before the next sacrifice, whether this is coming from fullness or from fear, whether this is making the other person more capable or more dependent, whether this is an expression of who you genuinely are or a management strategy for a relationship that would require renegotiation if you stopped being the one who gives most. The people who have resented you for your sacrifice are not entirely wrong that something in the dynamic needed to change. They are entirely wrong about what needed to change and about whose responsibility it was. But the seed of what they were responding to, even through the distortion of their resentment, was real. And understanding that is the beginning of giving differently, not less. Differently, in ways that leave both of you more than you were. 2 questions for the comments. First, what is the specific sacrifice you made that produced the most resentment in return? And what were you actually hoping it would produce? Second, what would change in your relationships right now if you gave only from genuine abundance, only what was genuinely asked for, and only in amounts that left you still capable of living your own life fully? Leave it below. The specific answers are the ones that reach the people who need them most. And if this kind of examination, the honest, precise look at what your giving has been organized around and what it has been producing, is work you want to continue, subscribe. Because the next video takes this directly into the territory this one opened. You were not wrong to give. You are wrong to believe that giving without limit would produce anything other than what it always produces. Now you know the mechanism. The question is what you do with that knowledge from here.